Of course, one of the things that greatly influences where and how we get information is politics. That terribly dirty word in most cultures. It's usually considered impolite to talk about politics, especially with strangers. This isn't true in every country. I always found that in Germany, people were very eager to talk about political matters as long as you were respectful. Ireland as well. But there are other parts of the world where it's completely forbidden. China, for example, you have to be very careful about how you talk about politics. But what is it? I mean, the root of the word, poly meaning many, and ix meaning the body of knowledge and practice. Basically, it's the knowledge and practice of dealing with the population, how the population comes together. Well, really? How is that different from, say, sociology? Well, that's a study of social groups. Not that different. And of course, economics is the body and practice of the economy. So these are all basically the same thing, aren't they? I mean, most political philosophies are really economic philosophies, and they have changed and evolved over the many years for a wide variety of reasons. Back in medieval times, you had a group of nobles at the top and people at the bottom, and most politics was really about who controlled the power, various factions. You'd see that work. Gradually, a politics of the people versus the nobles developed, and we started to see what we have as a linear split. You have one side, you have the other. How they influence each other, the people versus those at the top. Now, the needs of the people is, well, it's varied. I mean, it starts with feeding the bellies and working out from there. Having some economic opportunity, oh, that was the rise of free market ideas and liberalism. And for the longest time, it was the monarchy versus what? The merchants, the traders, the people who wanted an open system. Conservatism evolved away from monarchy as political systems evolved away towards a stable structure of business, etc., and very often religion. Whereas liberalism evolved to include things that brought people more together, influenced by socialism, for lack of a better word. But all of these isms, I mean, what do they really mean? Well, they've all evolved, as our whole political spectrum has. We still like to put things on a linear line. Why? Well, good journalism tries to be objective, at least. We would all like for it to be objective. And the easiest, simplest way to make things objective is to have two opposing viewpoints, right? You have this side, you have this side, they've both made their case, you decide for yourself. Fabulous. We put our politics on one line, everything is good. The problem is that both sides have been changing very rapidly. And of course, this is only natural because the situation in the world is changing. After World War II, we had basically a, a politics in the developed world, at least, that was if you favor labor unions and things like this that supposedly help the workers on one side and big business on the other. And big government often supported the working people, or at least that was a common view of it, and big business employed people. And so you have big versus big battling it out, left and right. Well, on the right wing spectrum, we often have religious things that come into it as well, cultural issues dealing with change. And of course, as change accelerated, we wound up with what? More resistance to the change in cultures. And on the other side, you have support for those different cultures coming in, making a multifaceted society. On the left, we also had the arrival of environmental issues, which are interesting because they are fundamentally conservative with a small c. Uh, they tend to be anti-progress, not intentionally, but at least slow down progress to make sure that we're not damaging things. On the right side, we had a whole bunch of support for businesses, a mercantile kind of system that make sure that our businesses in our country are doing well. That's kind of a left wing kind of idea. So, where does it all fit? I propose that in the world today, there is basically one politics: the open globalist viewpoint versus a nativist viewpoint. And that nativist viewpoint naturally changes from one culture to the next. In the Muslim world, for example, it's resistance to the openness. In the United States, we have pretty much the same thing. In Britain, we have Brexit or European. It kind of comes down the same. There are exceptions to this. Now, in a country like Russia or China that is more authoritarian, we have basically support for the existing structure, or, well, there might not be anything else, right? You're not allowed to talk about it. And this is where it gets interesting. See, when we talk about information right now, the world wants to know where we're going with this virus. How are we going to handle it? How are we going to tackle it? And how are we going to deal with the issues? Authoritarian countries that don't like to be open don't want to really talk about it so much. That sort of globalist perspective is either missing or under control. Now, the World Health Organization recently had 194 epidemiologists and health experts from 194 countries called for an independent investigation as to where the virus came from and the global response to it. What could we have done better? This is going to be resisted. And it is going to be resisted because authoritarian governments want to control information. Information is power, therefore we have a problem in our hands. And this is where the globalist side, which of course I am mostly on, has its own problems. I mean, when we connect different cultures and different economies, what is appropriate and what is not? When do we have enough that is in common? I would propose that any country that has an open society that allows criticism and the rule of law firmly established is going to be able to compete on a one-to-one basis. I mean, take South Korea, for example. They certainly have the rule of law. They certainly have an open system. I mean, Koreans, you can see them on various forums complaining very openly about their government one way or the other. But they have an extraordinarily top-down system that was developed. It is not really a free market as we would call it in the United States. Is that good enough? The answer seems to be yes. At least I would say so. You may have a different opinion. Now, in another country like, say, Russia or China, we don't have the rule of law firmly established. We don't have free expression. That becomes much more difficult. I mean, if you're going to make an investment in China, how do you know exactly how things are going? If you're going to buy products from Russia, how do you know exactly what you're buying? It comes down to the information. And it comes down to a global sense of politics, which influences the information we have. All politics is local, as Tip O'Neill once said. Actually, his dad said that first, told him that, according to his memoir. Which is to say that all politics starts with the people on the ground, what they're doing. So when we talk about, say, globalism or a nativist reaction to globalism, which I really do think is the spectrum that is beginning to define all of the world, each of those are expressed very differently from one country to the next. And so it becomes very difficult to understand our information, or the information that is circulated from it. How do we interpret things? How do we know what is actually the truth? Whether we're just trying to understand the progress of the virus and what we should see or what we should do for ourselves, or for that matter, if we're making an investment or buying products, or we want to take some kind of political action to support the ideas that we believe in, be they environmentalism or free enterprise or support for workers. What should you do? How do you get the right information? Well, the answer is that we all have to practice politics. I know it sounds like a dirty word, but there are many different kinds of the art and science of interaction, the body of knowledge and practice. There is office politics, domestic politics. It comes down to how we interact with each other, is really what it's all about. It's that simple. To me, it starts with a clear vision as to what you have for your values. Okay? That is spiritual and moral values and how you value them in something like an economy. An economy is one aspect of politics. It's a dominant one because people like to eat, but it is not the only one. And indeed, these other softer issues wind up influencing how that harder one that we have a way of keeping score, how it comes down. Should we try to get rid of politics? Should we get it out of our journalism? No. Is the one side versus the other going to continue to be adequate? Actually, no, because each side is getting more and more complicated. Each side is getting more and more diverse. The process of opening things up to roughly 7 billion different viewpoints makes the idea of a completely linear system largely unworkable. The only answer is that everybody has to become more knowledgeable about how they receive information, about their own confirmational bias, and where that fits with things that you really are not going to give up on, those fundamental morals, and those things that maybe um, are more negotiable. It's important for you to know that line between the two in order to digest information that comes from all over the planet. It also is important that we have a greater understanding of where everybody is coming from. You might have that globalist view that, everything kind of comes together one way or the other, but it's going to be met with a nativist view that's going to be different from one country to another. And indeed, the globalism, the global perspective changes. Here in the United States, well, we're on top for now. That influences how we do everything or how we see everything. So, your values versus the values of the rest of the world. How do you match the two? What is truly important? What can you give up? It's difficult. There is no one answer. There is only an answer for you. But simply saying we need to get rid of politics in our information, we need to get rid of politics in our politics, that's not the right answer. We do need to practice politics more elegantly, more diplomatically, with more kindness and decency. Absolutely. We need to realize that we are all just people dealing with our own different systems in different ways. People are people, but cultures are cultures. The forces that impinge on any given person are going to be different from one place to the next. Are they so different that we probably need to set up some kind of barriers because we interaction completely freely just doesn't make sense? There are times when that's the case. What is an acceptable difference? I happen to think that there are very rare times when a barrier needs to be set up. But as we've seen with the progress of the virus, sometimes barriers do need to be set up, don't they? If nothing else, to protect our own population from an immediate threat. A virus is one example, but what about economic considerations? What about super cheap labor? There are certain things that a developed nation can do to take care of its own business. I've already talked at length about the tax that we put on employment. What can we do to really encourage employment in a world that is driven by technology and workers are replaced more and more by robots, not necessarily even cheap workers from another nation? There are things that we can do for ourselves. There are things we can do to protect our environment, protect our workers, protect our children and the elderly and other vulnerable people. Of course, that is the mark of a civilized society. How best to do that? It's not about getting rid of politics. There will always be an art and science and practice of interaction. It's a question of how we do it. And it starts with your own personal values, knowing exactly what you can't give up on. Do you have a clear vision as to what the future is going to be? What you think is valuable? What you need to hold on to? That's my question for you. And that's what I hope we can, well, work through a little bit in all of this. Thank you.